Most people believe they are disconnected from their intuition because they lack spirituality, discipline, or some rare inner gift. In reality, what disconnects you from your intuition is far more subtle and far more common: mental noise, emotional conditioning, and a life lived almost entirely in reaction. Over time, you learn to trust logic more than sensation, approval more than alignment, urgency more than clarity. And without realizing it, you slowly stop listening to the quiet signals that once guided you naturally. Intuition does not disappear. It becomes overshadowed. It lowers its volume when the mind is constantly racing, anticipating problems, replaying the past, or negotiating with fear. When every decision is filtered through anxiety, self-doubt, or the need to please, intuition feels unreliable, distant, or even dangerous. Not because it is wrong, but because it does not speak the language of control. It speaks the language of coherence, presence, and inner truth. There is a reason so many people feel stuck despite doing everything right. They follow advice, consume information, and try to optimize their lives, yet something still feels off. That feeling is not failure, it is feedback. It is the body and the deeper self signaling that the path being taken may be logical, but it is not aligned. Intuition often shows up first as discomfort, hesitation, or a subtle resistance that cannot be explained rationally. This video is not about blind faith, magical thinking, or ignoring reason. It is about restoring your ability to perceive inner signals clearly and responsibly. You will learn how intuition actually works, why it becomes muted, and how a simple, grounded quantum practice can elevate your consciousness and bring you back onto a path that feels internally coherent. In just a few days, with the right structure and attention, clarity begins to replace confusion, and decisions stop feeling heavy. What returns is not certainty, but trust. Trust in yourself, in your perception, and in your ability to move forward without betraying who you are. The silent reason intuition gets ignored, the noise that replaces inner signals. There is a quiet shift that happens long before intuition feels lost. It begins when the mind becomes the primary authority, and the body is reduced to a tool that must keep up. Decisions are made faster, reactions become automatic, and internal space slowly disappears. What once felt like a natural sense of direction becomes buried under constant evaluation, comparison, and anticipation. The modern rhythm rewards speed and certainty, not perception. Over time, this rhythm trains the nervous system to stay alert, scanning for problems rather than listening for guidance. In this state, intuition does not vanish, it becomes inconvenient. It speaks in sensations, subtle emotions, and fleeting impressions, while the mind demands evidence, guarantees, and explanations. When life is lived in permanent alert mode, subtle signals feel unreliable. They are dismissed as overthinking, weakness, or emotional noise. The irony is that what gets labeled as noise is often the most honest information available, arriving before logic has time to construct a narrative. Conditioning and the fear of being wrong. Another layer of disconnection comes from conditioning. From an early age, most people learn that approval equals safety. Choices that align with expectations are rewarded, while choices that come from inner knowing are questioned. Over time, this creates a subtle association. Trusting oneself feels risky, while following external rules feels responsible. Intuition, which often challenges familiar patterns, becomes associated with danger rather than wisdom. This conditioning does not disappear with adulthood. It evolves. It shows up as overthinking, second-guessing, and the constant need to justify choices internally before making them. Even when a decision feels right on a deeper level, fear of judgment or failure can override that signal. The body tightens, the mind rationalizes, and intuition is quietly pushed aside in favor of what appears sensible. What is lost is not logic, but balance. The body as the first messenger. Intuition does not arrive as a voice for most people. It arrives as a physiological response. A subtle expansion in the chest, a sense of calm, or an unexplainable resistance are often the first indicators. The body reacts before the mind organizes meaning. When these signals are repeatedly ignored, the body learns that its messages are not welcome. Tension becomes chronic, sensations are numbed, and emotional awareness dulls. This creates a feedback loop. The less attention is given to bodily signals, the harder they become to interpret. Sensations blur together, and the difference between anxiety and intuition becomes unclear. What once felt like guidance now feels confusing. This confusion reinforces reliance on logic alone, further silencing the body's language. The result is a life that looks functional on the surface but feels strangely disconnected internally. Stress as a distortion field. Chronic stress plays a decisive role in this process. When the nervous system is constantly activated, perception narrows. The brain prioritizes threat detection and short-term survival over reflection and integration. In this state, intuition is not accessible in its clearest form. Signals are filtered through fear, urgency, and the need for control. What feels like intuition may actually be conditioned anxiety, while true intuitive signals are overlooked because they do not match the emotional intensity of stress. This is why many people feel most disconnected from themselves during periods of high pressure. It is not because guidance disappears, but because the internal environment becomes hostile to subtle awareness. Stress demands answers now. Intuition unfolds in its own time. When urgency dominates, patience disappears, and with it, the capacity to perceive deeper truth. The illusion of control. Ignoring intuition is often justified by the desire for control. Control feels safe. It promises predictability in an uncertain world. Yet control relies on past data, learned patterns, and familiar outcomes. Intuition, by contrast, often points toward the unfamiliar. It suggests paths that cannot be fully explained in advance. This makes it uncomfortable for a mind trained to equate certainty with security. Over time, control becomes an identity. Being rational, prepared, and cautious becomes a source of self-worth. Intuition threatens this identity by introducing ambiguity. It asks for trust rather than proof. When identity is tied to being right, listening to intuition feels like surrendering authority. The result is an internal conflict where logic dominates not because it is superior, but because it feels safer. Fragmentation and inner division. When intuition is consistently ignored, fragmentation occurs. There is a growing gap between what feels true internally and what is expressed externally. Decisions may appear successful, yet they carry an undercurrent of dissatisfaction. This division creates subtle exhaustion. Energy is spent maintaining coherence on the outside while suppressing dissonance on the inside. This fragmentation is not dramatic, it accumulates quietly. It shows up as loss of enthusiasm, chronic indecision, or a sense of being off track without knowing why. Intuition continues to send signals, but they are filtered through layers of doubt and conditioning. The person begins to mistrust their own perception, relying increasingly on external validation to compensate for the internal disconnect. Why intuition feels risky. At its core, intuition feels risky because it challenges familiarity. It often asks for alignment before comfort, truth before approval. For a system conditioned to prioritize safety through conformity, this feels destabilizing. The mind interprets this destabilization as danger, even when the body senses alignment. This misinterpretation reinforces avoidance. Yet intuition is not reckless. It is precise but subtle. It does not demand dramatic leaps. It signals direction. When ignored repeatedly, it does not punish. It withdraws into the background, waiting for conditions that allow it to be heard again. Understanding this dynamic is the first shift toward restoring clarity, not by forcing intuition to speak louder, but by reducing the internal noise that drowns it out. When anxiety imitates intuition, the confusion between urgency and truth, one of the most subtle obstacles in recognizing intuition, is how easily anxiety disguises itself as guidance. Anxiety speaks with intensity, repetition, and pressure. It insists on immediate resolution, convincing the mind that action is necessary right now to avoid loss, embarrassment, or regret. Because of its emotional charge, it often feels convincing. Intuition, by contrast, rarely rushes. It arrives quietly, without demand, and without the emotional volatility that characterizes anxious thought. When urgency dominates the internal landscape, everything feels important. Decisions feel heavy, and the absence of clarity feels intolerable. In this state, the nervous system seeks relief rather than alignment. The mind labels this drive toward relief as intuition, when in reality, it is an attempt to escape discomfort. Over time, this mislabeling trains the individual to distrust their inner signals altogether, because following anxiety rarely leads to peace. Emotional conditioning and pattern recognition. The brain is a pattern recognition system. It learns from repetition and emotional intensity. Experiences charged with fear, shame, or rejection leave strong imprints. When similar situations arise later, the brain reacts quickly, often before conscious awareness. This reaction can feel like intuition because it is fast and embodied, but it is actually memory-based prediction. True intuition is not a replay of the past. It is a present-moment integration of perception, sensation, and subtle awareness. Anxiety, on the other hand, is oriented toward the future but rooted in the past. It projects old outcomes onto new circumstances. The challenge arises when these two internal signals are not distinguished. The mind assumes that speed equals wisdom, when in reality speed often reflects conditioning. The role of the nervous system. The state of the nervous system determines how inner signals are interpreted. When the system is regulated, perception widens. Sensations are clearer and emotional responses are proportionate. In this state, intuition feels grounded and steady. When the system is dysregulated, perception narrows. Sensations intensify, emotions spike, and thoughts loop. In this state, anxiety dominates the internal narrative. This explains why clarity often arrives after moments of calm rather than during emotional peaks. It is not that intuition appears suddenly. It becomes accessible when internal tension decreases. Anxiety thrives on tension. Intuition requires coherence. Without understanding this distinction, many people assume they lack intuitive ability, when in fact, their internal environment is simply too reactive to allow subtle perception. Why overthinking feels responsible? Overthinking is often mistaken for careful consideration. It feels productive because it engages the intellect and creates the illusion of control. Yet, overthinking rarely resolves uncertainty. It amplifies it. Each thought generates another possibility, another risk, another scenario to evaluate. This mental noise drowns out the quieter signals of intuition. Culturally, overthinking is rewarded. It is associated with intelligence, responsibility, and diligence. Intuition, by contrast, is often dismissed as vague or unreliable. This bias reinforces the habit of mental analysis at the expense of embodied awareness. Over time, individuals become skilled at thinking but disconnected from sensing. Decisions are made through mental endurance rather than internal alignment. The emotional aftermath of ignored signals. When anxiety-driven decisions override intuitive signals, the consequences are not always immediate. On the surface, things may appear fine, yet internally, a residue remains. There is often a subtle sense of regret, tension, or dissatisfaction that cannot be easily explained. This emotional residue accumulates, reinforcing the belief that decisions are burdensome rather than empowering. This accumulation leads to decision fatigue. Choices feel exhausting because each one involves internal conflict. The mind argues, the body resists, and resolution feels forced. Intuition, which could simplify the process, remains inaccessible because it has been repeatedly dismissed. The individual learns to rely on mental effort rather than inner clarity, increasing stress over time. The illusion of intensity as guidance. Another common distortion is equating emotional intensity with truth. Strong feelings are assumed to indicate importance or accuracy. However, intensity often reflects unresolved emotion rather than insight. Anxiety is intense because it activates survival mechanisms. Intuition is subtle because it operates beyond survival narratives. This misunderstanding leads people to chase strong emotions, mistaking them for signs. They become reactive to inner turbulence, interpreting every spike of feeling as a message. This creates instability rather than guidance. Intuition does not fluctuate wildly. It remains consistent even when emotions change. Recognizing this difference is essential for restoring trust in inner perception. Mental exhaustion and loss of signal. Prolonged anxiety and overthinking exhaust the cognitive system. When mental energy is depleted, sensitivity decreases. Subtle awareness fades, replaced by blunt reactions. This exhaustion is often mistaken for numbness or disconnection when it is actually a protective shutdown. The system reduces sensitivity to prevent overload. In this state, Intuition feels inaccessible not because it is absent, but because the system lacks the capacity to perceive it. Rest, regulation, and reduced stimulation naturally restore sensitivity. However, without understanding this mechanism, individuals may interpret numbness as personal failure rather than a signal to restore balance. Reclaiming discernment without forcing. Clarity emerges not from forcing answers, but from creating internal conditions where discernment becomes possible. When anxiety is recognized for what it is, its authority diminishes. It loses its ability to impersonate intuition. Over time, patterns become visible. Anxiety demands immediate certainty and relief. Intuition offers direction without pressure. This distinction does not require perfection. It develops gradually through awareness. As sensitivity returns, decisions feel less dramatic. Inner signals become easier to recognize, not because they grow louder, but because internal noise decreases. In this quieter space, intuition regains its natural role as a steady, reliable guide rather than a mysterious or unreliable force. The fragmentation between mind, body, and direction, living in pieces without noticing. One of the most overlooked reasons intuition feels unreliable is internal fragmentation. This fragmentation does not appear suddenly or dramatically. It develops slowly as the mind, body, and sense of direction stop operating as a unified system. Life becomes something that is managed rather than inhabited. Thoughts dominate decisions, emotions are tolerated or suppressed, and the body is expected to comply. In this state, intuition struggles to emerge because intuition depends on integration. Fragmentation feels normal because it is common. Many people function efficiently while feeling disconnected. They meet responsibilities, achieve goals, and maintain appearances. Yet there is an underlying sense of misalignment. This sensation is difficult to articulate, so it is often ignored. Over time, ignoring it becomes a habit. The individual adapts to living slightly out of sync with themselves, mistaking endurance for stability. The cost of emotional suppression. Emotions are not obstacles to intuition, they are carriers of information. When emotions are consistently suppressed or overridden by logic, important data is lost. The body records emotional experience even when the mind dismisses it. This creates internal tension. Signals accumulate without resolution, manifesting as chronic stress, irritability, or fatigue. When emotions are not processed, they distort perception. Intuition requires emotional honesty, not emotional overwhelm. Suppression narrows awareness just as much as reactivity does. In both cases, the signal becomes unclear. The individual may feel confused, unable to distinguish genuine insight from emotional residue. This confusion reinforces dependence on external guidance, further weakening internal trust. Identity, built on adaptation. Many people build their identity around adaptation. They become skilled at adjusting to circumstances, meeting expectations, and avoiding conflict. While adaptability is valuable, it becomes problematic when it replaces authenticity. Intuition often challenges adaptive patterns by highlighting internal truth that contradicts external demands. When identity is tied to being agreeable, reliable, or rational, intuition feels threatening. It suggests change, boundaries, or redirection. The mind responds by questioning its validity. Over time, the individual learns to ignore intuitive signals to preserve identity coherence. This preservation comes at the cost of inner alignment. The person remains consistent externally while feeling increasingly disconnected internally. The illusion of stability. Fragmentation creates an illusion of stability. Life appears organized, predictable, and controlled. Yet beneath this structure lies rigidity. Flexibility decreases. Spontaneity feels unsafe. New possibilities are evaluated through the lens of risk rather than resonance. Intuition, which thrives on openness, cannot operate fully in rigid systems. This rigidity often manifests as chronic indecision. The mind analyzes endlessly because no option feels fully right. The body signals resistance, but the signal is dismissed as fear. The individual becomes trapped between options, not because the right path is unclear, but because internal alignment has been compromised. Intuition cannot guide when the system is divided. The body's memory of misalignment. The body remembers every time intuition was ignored. not as a narrative but as tension. Muscles tighten, posture shifts, breathing patterns change. Over time, these physical adaptations become baseline. The individual no longer notices the tension because it feels normal, yet this tension interferes with perception. Subtle sensations are masked by chronic contraction. This is why intuitive clarity often correlates with physical ease. When the body is relaxed, perception expands. When the body is tense, perception narrows. Ignoring intuition reinforces tension, which further reduces sensitivity. The cycle continues until numbness sets in. At that point, intuition feels absent, but it is merely inaccessible. Direction versus momentum. Another aspect of fragmentation is confusing momentum with direction. Momentum keeps life moving. Direction gives life meaning. It is possible to have strong momentum while moving away from alignment. Productivity increases, but satisfaction decreases. Intuition is the system that recalibrates direction when momentum drifts. When intuition is ignored, momentum takes over completely. Life becomes a series of reactions to previous decisions. Change feels difficult because stopping momentum feels dangerous. Yet without pauses for recalibration, direction is lost. The individual may feel successful while simultaneously feeling empty, a contradiction that creates internal strain, mental narratives, and self-betrayal. To maintain fragmentation, the mind creates narratives that justify misalignment. These narratives sound reasonable. They emphasize responsibility, realism, and sacrifice. Over time, they become internalized beliefs. The individual convinces themselves that discomfort is normal, that dissatisfaction is inevitable, that intuition is unreliable. Each time an intuitive signal is overridden, a subtle act of self-betrayal occurs. This betrayal is rarely conscious. It is framed as practicality or maturity, yet the emotional system registers it. Trust erodes internally. The person becomes hesitant to listen inwardly because past signals were dismissed. Intuition withdraws, not out of punishment, but out of learned irrelevance. The gradual loss of inner authority. As fragmentation deepens, inner authority weakens. Decisions increasingly rely on external input. Advice, validation, and comparison replace self-reference. The individual may feel informed yet uncertain, surrounded by information yet lacking clarity. Intuition, which once provided orientation, is replaced by consensus and trend. This loss of inner authority creates vulnerability. Without a stable internal reference point, choices feel precarious. Fear of making the wrong decision intensifies. The mind compensates by seeking more data, more reassurance, more confirmation. The cycle reinforces itself, pushing intuition further into the background. Reintegration as the foundation of clarity. Intuition becomes accessible again when integration begins. Integration does not require dramatic change. It begins with awareness of fragmentation. Recognizing the split between mind, body, and direction creates the possibility of coherence. When attention returns to sensation, emotion, and internal response, signals start to reorganize. Clarity is not forced. It emerges as fragmentation dissolves. The body relaxes, emotions become informative rather than overwhelming, and the mind regains its role as interpreter rather than dictator. In this integrated state, intuition feels less mysterious. It becomes a natural extension of self-awareness, guiding decisions quietly, consistently, and without urgency. The quantum shift that restores inner coherence, a change of state, not a change of belief. The restoration of intuition does not begin with adopting new beliefs or rejecting old ones. It begins with a change of internal state. This distinction matters because belief operates at the level of thought, while intuition operates at the level of perception. When perception shifts, belief often follows naturally. Without this shift, belief becomes an idea layered on top of the same internal patterns, producing little real change. The term quantum is often misunderstood as something abstract or mystical. In this context, it refers to a transition between states of being. A state is the combination of emotional tone, bodily regulation, attention, and expectation that shapes how reality is interpreted. When the internal state changes, the same external circumstances are perceived differently. Options that once felt invisible become noticeable. Decisions that felt heavy begin to feel clear, not because the world changed, but because perception expanded, from reaction to presence. Most people live in reaction. Reaction is efficient, familiar, and exhausting. It relies on past experiences to predict future outcomes. Intuition, however, arises from presence. Presence is not passive awareness, it is an active state of receptivity. In presence, the mind is engaged without being dominant, and the body is sensed without being overwhelmed. The shift from reaction to presence feels subtle at first. It often appears as a slowing of internal tempo. Thoughts become less urgent. Sensations become more distinguishable. Emotional responses soften without disappearing. In this space, intuition has room to emerge. It does not interrupt, it informs. It does not command, it aligns. Presence creates the internal conditions where intuition becomes reliable rather than sporadic. Coherence as the language of intuition. Intuition communicates through coherence. Coherence is the felt sense of alignment between thought, emotion, and bodily sensation. When coherence is present, decisions feel internally consistent, even if they are challenging. When coherence is absent, decisions feel fragmented, requiring constant justification. This coherence is not emotional pleasure. It is stability. Anxiety disrupts coherence by pulling attention into imagined futures. Suppression disrupts coherence by disconnecting sensation from awareness. Coherence emerges when attention returns to the present moment without force. In this state, intuition does not compete with logic. Logic becomes a tool that supports intuitive insight rather than replacing it. The role of attention in perception. Attention shapes reality. What is attended to becomes amplified. What is ignored fades. When attention is habitually directed outward toward problems, expectations, and comparisons, inner signals weaken. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological pattern. The brain prioritizes what it practices. When attention shifts inward in a grounded way, perception reorganizes. Subtle sensations become meaningful again. Emotional cues regain clarity. Intuition, which relies on these cues, becomes accessible. This shift does not require withdrawal from life. It requires a rebalancing of attention, allowing internal information to hold equal weight with external input. Time, patience, and neural recalibration. The return of intuitive clarity follows a biological rhythm. Neural patterns formed over years do not dissolve instantly. As the internal state shifts, the nervous system recalibrates. This recalibration can feel unfamiliar. Periods of clarity may alternate with periods of doubt. This fluctuation is not regression, it is adjustment. During recalibration, the mind may attempt to reassert control. It questions the validity of subtle insights, seeking certainty. Over time, as coherence becomes familiar, this questioning softens. Intuition begins to feel normal rather than exceptional. Decisions require less mental effort because internal conflict decreases. Why simplicity is effective. Complexity often masks avoidance. Elaborate frameworks can distract from direct perception. Intuition responds to simplicity because simplicity reduces cognitive load. When the system is not overwhelmed, perception sharpens naturally. This is why profound insight often arises in quiet moments rather than during intense analysis. Simplicity does not mean lack of depth, it means clarity of focus. When attention is not scattered, internal signals become distinct. The quantum shift toward coherence is not dramatic. It is subtle, cumulative, and sustainable. It manifests as increased ease in decision-making and a reduction in internal friction, identity, and the fear of change. As intuition strengthens, identity may feel challenged. Patterns that once defined the self lose relevance. This can create discomfort. The mind may interpret this discomfort as instability. In reality, it reflects growth. Intuition often guides toward authenticity rather than familiarity. Letting go of outdated identity structures creates space for integration. The self becomes less rigid, more responsive. Intuition thrives in this flexibility. It does not seek to dismantle identity, but to refine it, aligning external expression with internal truth. Consistency over intensity. Intuitive clarity does not require intense emotional experiences. It develops through consistency. Small, repeated shifts in attention and state accumulate. Over time, the nervous system learns that coherence is safe. Anxiety loses its dominance. Presence becomes accessible without effort. This consistency builds trust. Trust in perception, trust in internal signals, trust in the ability to navigate uncertainty. As trust grows, intuition no longer feels risky. It becomes a stable reference point, quietly guiding choices without drama. The subtle return of direction. Direction often returns before certainty. There may not be a clear destination, but there is a sense of orientation. Choices begin to align with internal values rather than external pressure. This alignment reduces regret and increases resilience. Even difficult decisions feel grounded. This is the essence of the quantum shift. It is not about controlling outcomes, but about restoring internal coherence. When coherence is present, intuition operates naturally. The individual moves forward with awareness rather than urgency, guided by a sense of inner stability that does not depend on constant reassurance. Integration as a living process. The restoration of intuition is not a final achievement. It is an ongoing process of integration. As life changes, coherence must be renewed. This renewal becomes easier with awareness. Intuition is no longer something to chase or prove. It becomes a quiet companion, present in the background, offering direction through sensation, emotion, and subtle knowing. In this integrated state, consciousness feels elevated not because it escapes reality, but because it engages reality more fully. The individual is no longer fragmented between thought and feeling, action and meaning. Intuition, once ignored, resumes its role as an internal compass, guiding the path forward with calm precision. Intuition was never meant to be something extraordinary, rare or reserved for a few. It was always designed to be a quiet, consistent presence, guiding decisions through coherence rather than force. What happened over time was not its disappearance, but a gradual distancing. Layers of noise, pressure, conditioning, and fear accumulated, making inner signals harder to perceive and easier to dismiss. Yet beneath all of that, intuition remained intact, waiting for space rather than belief. Throughout this journey, one pattern becomes clear. Whenever life feels confusing, heavy, or misaligned, it is rarely because the path is missing. It is because attention has drifted away from the internal signals that reveal direction. The mind, when left unchecked, tries to replace intuition with control. It analyzes, predicts, and rehearses, believing safety lies in certainty. But certainty is rarely available in moments of growth. Intuition, by contrast, does not offer guarantees. It offers alignment, and alignment, while quieter, is far more sustainable. As coherence returns, something subtle but profound shifts. Decisions begin to feel less like battles and more like responses. The body no longer resists every choice. Emotional energy stabilizes. The constant need to justify, explain, or defend internal truth starts to dissolve. This does not mean life becomes effortless. It means life becomes more honest. Challenges still arise, but they are met from a place of internal stability rather than fragmentation. What many people call the right path is not a fixed destination. It is a state of congruence between who you are internally and how you move through the world. When intuition is restored, that congruence becomes accessible again. You may not always know the outcome, but you recognize the direction, and that recognition brings calm, even in uncertainty. Perhaps the most important realization is this: intuition strengthens when you stop abandoning yourself. Every moment of inner coherence rebuilds trust. Every decision that honors internal truth reinforces clarity. Over time, intuition no longer feels like something you need to chase or interpret. It becomes a natural extension of awareness, guiding you quietly, steadily, without urgency or fear. The path was never lost. It was simply drowned out. And as the noise settles, what remains is not confusion, but a deep grounded knowing that has been with you all along. Before this video ends, consider this carefully. When was the last time you ignored a quiet inner signal, even though you felt it was true, simply because it felt safer to follow what was familiar? That question is not meant to create guilt or pressure. It is meant to create awareness. because awareness is the doorway through which clarity returns. If something in this video resonated, it is likely because part of you already recognizes that inner coherence is possible again. That recognition is not accidental. If you want to continue exploring this state of clarity, alignment, and conscious direction, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. New videos are created specifically to deepen this understanding, not through empty motivation, but through grounded insight that supports real inner transformation. Subscribing ensures that this work continues to meet you where you are, as you are. As the screen transitions, there is another video waiting for you. It builds directly on what you have just experienced, expanding this understanding and taking it further. Allow yourself to continue. Stay present, stay curious, and most importantly, stay connected to the quiet intelligence within you that already knows how to move forward. The next step is already in front of you.